our intro slides have just stopped. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. And you had the opportunity to look at our slides that gave some announcements and some background. And I wanted to introduce our speaker today, Pete Johnson. And I do have the chat open if you want to ask questions in the chat prior to the end of the formal presentation. We'll try to get to as many of those questions at the end as possible. So feel free to use a chat to type in questions. So Pete Johnson grew up in Florida and graduated from the University of Central Florida in 1995 with a BS in limnology. Since then, he has worked as a professional biologist, mainly in Florida and the southeastern United States in both the public and private sectors. His current position as a senior biologist and project manager for Oneida Environmental allows him to work on a wide range of project types, from regulatory permitting to natural resources management, ecological monitoring and restoration, invasive species management, and more. Pete has been a PWS since 2009. He manages a 500-acre wetland preserve known as the Crosby Sanctuary for the Duval Audubon Society. He also enjoys cycling, birding, and going on hikes with his wife and 3 dogs. Pete is most passionate about botany and birds and is an avid user of iNaturalist and eBird to document species observations. He once documented Brachystephanus rosaceus on a trip to Uganda that was the first ever observation of this globally endangered species on iNaturalist. His photo of this were used by the Kew Botanical Gardens for tropical important plant areas project within Uganda. So I want to welcome our listeners. Thank you for your time in participating today. And Pete, I turn it over to you for the beginning of your presentation. And thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Roy. Appreciate the intro here. And I will say that iNaturalist has a lot of observations available to look at in the area of this project. So I encourage anybody to pull up iNaturalist and look in the Everglades areas at the different species that have been recorded there. And with that, I will jump into the presentation here. Okay, so my presentation today is Everglades Tree Island Monitoring in Water Conservation Area 3B and the Blue Shanty Flowway.
Pete,
Pete,
sorry to interrupt. I don't see that you're sharing. I don't know what others are seeing, but I did not see your presentation start.
That would help.
Well, I'm not sure what others see. Justin, if you're on the line, perhaps you could tell us what you're seeing.
No, I did. I forgot to hit share. Thank you.
Oh, all right, so I got that one right. All right, go ahead.
All right. All right. So yes, again, the Water Conservation Area 3B and the Blue Shanty Flowway. And I'm the primary presenter today. I listed my colleague Jennifer Bright on the cover slide here. She's not an official co-presenter today, and I just wanted to name her on the cover slide in recognition of her contributions to the project. She is in attendance and can help me answer questions at the end of the presentation if needed. So here's a 10,000 foot overview of the Everglades restoration. First of all, in the past, present, and future, going from left to right. As you can see, they were trying to restore water flow as much as possible and spread it out instead of pumping it out to the east and west. I'm going to go ahead and turn on a pointer. Hopefully everybody can see the red dot. So today we're essentially in this condition, and this is the goal. And the reason I'm giving you these overview slides is to set up the tree island monitoring part. So yeah, so on slide 3 here, you see an overview of the Central and Southern Everglades restoration components. And Water Conservation Area 3B's location isn't very well shown on here, but it's generally this triangle area where it does say 3B in the corner. It's important to note that the Miccosukee tribe has lands and deep cultural heritage in this portion of the Everglades ecosystem, and their lands are indicated by the red shaded area here in the center. Okay, zooming in a little bit more, this is kind of setting up the activities that are going on that require the tree islands to be monitored. So looking at first they were talking about, this is kind of a busy slide, but I'll try to go through it real quick. The S33 North structure, which is this structure right here, increased flow there. I believe it says that's completed. Several of these are completed as well as we were working down there. The L67A canal, which is right here, they built these three structures. First of all, this is the L67A and L67C canals, also known as the pocket in between these areas, if anybody's familiar with this part of the Everglades. And then this pink line, these are existing, and this pink line is a proposed levee called the Blue Shanty levee. So in order to get the flow through here, they want to put more flow through west of the Blue Shanty and less flow east of the Blue Shanty. So they're putting in these three structures, which I believe are already constructed, and removing levees along these canals, creating gaps in these levees along where these yellow crosses are, and doing some other things down in here and removing a levee that exists here, an extension, and also here as well, removing an old Tamiami Trail section to allow more flow. So all of that together is going to push more flow down in a wider range down here into the Southern Everglades and the Shark River Slough, which is a historic wide flowway, sloughway down through here. So our area, our tree islands, we're basically on the west and east side of this proposed Blue Shanty levee. And here are some links. I can share these. We can try to share these with you later. These give more big picture information onto the entire plans for these areas down there. So this is a map showing, zoomed out map of the tree islands on a topographic map. And I didn't put the Blue Shanty on the map, but it essentially splits, well, it starts somewhere in here and it splits these 13 islands down the middle. So they wanted us to monitor islands both within the proposed Blue Shanty flowway and outside of the flowway. And as you can see, we had 7 inside and 6 outside. And this project was initially scoped for 5 years monitoring period. However, funding only allowed for 3 years. And the objectives were to conduct monitoring of vegetative structure, hydrologic regimes, and soil elevations on the islands during the wet season for these items, and then wildlife utilization with wildlife cameras year-round. Here is an aerial photograph of the area showing the actual islands. We traced around them. These aren't necessarily the exact boundaries of the treed portions of the areas, but these are the heavier treed portions of these islands. As you can see, they're oriented north to south, and they're somewhat teardrop shaped, and that is a result of the flow, this current and historic, really, that would come down through here, flowing from north to south, and it would sort of taper these islands off like this. And these are the numbers of the islands, and these red dots, hopefully everybody can see them. indicate where our wildlife cameras were located. So to get to these islands, pretty much need an airboat, and you have to do it in the wet season. Otherwise, the water levels are too low even for an airboat. And this was our main mode of transportation out there. And we contracted with a local airboat operator, tour operator, who was extremely helpful to have on board, being that they lived very close by and operated in these waters basically on a daily, almost daily basis. So, and local second generation airboat operator in the area, so with extensive knowledge. Highly recommended. Okay, so moving on. This is the morphology of a typical morphology of a tree island. You have at the north end, you'll have the head, which is typically the highest elevation portion of the island. And then as you taper back to the south, you come to an area called the near tail, and this is an approximate location. It's essentially where the vegetation starts transitioning from the main dominant tree island species to more marsh-like or sawgrass marsh species. And it tends to taper out quite a bit. So there's a long transition, and the tail is pretty much, always wet, and almost all marsh species and different tree species as well. But yeah, so beautiful, beautiful island here. I believe this was 3B 18-4, yeah. So let me say one more thing about these tree islands is that while they are called islands, they are not necessarily uplands. In fact, all of these tree islands are fully wetland ecosystems. None of them had truly uplands on them. So looking at from the head of a tree island at the interior, you can see very dense trees, and these are pretty much all in this picture pond apple trees, which grow in and dominate in the Everglades areas on treed ecosystems. Pretty much in the eastern Everglades only. As you move west toward Big Cypress, it transitions away from these species that we're going to talk about here today and into more cypress dominated trees. And again, besides pond apple, the other dominant head area species were these giant leather ferns and a few other species mixed in, but we'll get to that. Okay, so the vegetation monitoring consisted of, first of all, of the trees. And we took certain measurements from the trees from 4 10-meter squared plots, 2 in the head and 2 in the near tail. And this picture illustrates not only what the tree island looks like, but also the near tail. This is kind of what a near tail is going to start looking like, with some cattails coming in and less pond apple and more willow and dahoon holly and maybe some wax myrtles, things like that. So yeah, and we would mark or measure, take our measurements on the trees, tie a flag on them, and also mark them with a permanent tag so that we could come back and measure the same numbered tree every time. And let me just say that it's not that easy to get around on these tree islands, but it is possible. Here's another slide showing kind of a near tail looking area, and also illustrating that we did take ground cover vegetation monitoring data from 21 meter squared plots within each 10 meter squared plot. So 20 ground cover plots were taken in each 10 meter squared plot. So as results here, we have the species of trees that we recorded on these tree islands. Not a huge diversity of trees, but consistently these same trees across all of the most of the tree islands. And pond apple, cocoa plum, strangler fig, dahoon holly, sweet bay magnolia, wax myrtle, swamp bay, Carolina willow, American elder, and the only invasive species we included on here or detected out there was Brazilian pepper. So the measurements we took were diameter at breast height of any tree or shrub above 2.5 centimeters DBH. The height of each tree using a telescoping measuring device. Canopy crown, meter squared canopy crown, as well as a health estimate of each tree. And then, so what we found was approximately 10 to 45 trees within each 10 by 10 meter plot. And some of those trees included multi-stems up to, I think maybe the most we ever saw were 4 or 5 stems, which presented a little bit of a challenge on how to record those, but we worked that out. Yeah, and so this whole data collection and monitoring was a baseline data collection phase. So basically pre-project, pre-Blue Shanty Flowway. And we did not conduct trend analyses. We did not run trend analyses or statistics over the data over the 3-year period. And this slide shows our ground cover vegetation monitoring species that were observed. As you can see, quite a bit of the tree species, seedlings and saplings within the ground cover. And these would be anything under 2.5 centimeters DBH. So all of those same tree species. And then in the ground, I've got some of these highlighted. The yellows are the more common or most common species that we observed and recorded the most ground cover percent coverage. But quite a good diversity of other species as well mixed in. But these 3, giant leather fern, swamp fern, and phylipterous fern called Hottentot fern. Unfortunately, there was some old world climbing fern as well, which is another invasive exotic problematic plant in South Florida. However, I will note that we only detected small amounts of it, and the National Park Service, I believe, that manages this area does regular invasive plant control. So they kept that and the Brazilian pepper down to a minimum. It's impossible to completely eliminate it, but it was not very commonly found on these tree islands. If left alone, probably the tree islands would be completely covered with these 2 species, unfortunately. So yeah, the ground cover vegetation percent coverages were recorded using a cover classification system to facilitate being able to efficiently record the percent coverages. This is the one that we used. And this graph over here kind of shows for the 3 most common species, kind of their average cover class for these 3 dominant ground cover species by tree island. So essentially, the highest one would be the swamp fern at roughly 25 to 33% on average throughout those monitoring plots, all 4 plots. Some areas definitely had higher than that, and some lower, and these are just the averages. So moving on to the soil elevation monitoring. First, we had to measure the already preset benchmarks, survey markers out in the sawgrass marshes to get the current water level above the benchmark elevation. So the benchmarks were rods driven into the lime rock substrate underneath the Everglades to anchor them in and make sure that they are stable. And every time we visited these benchmarks, the water was above. They're encased in a pipe with a cap, and we would have to reach way down in the water and get to the top of this rod. So yeah, so step one, measure the top of the benchmark in relation to water. Two, measure the soil surface elevation in relation to the surface if the water was standing on the tree island, or groundwater if the water was below the soil at the tree island at 3 locations at the head of the tree island. And measurements must be taken from the benchmark nearest each tree island and at the tree island on the same day as soon as possible, just to avoid any changes in water levels that would make the elevation different. Okay, this is a busy slide, but the main thing I wanted you to note was the height of water level above benchmarks in all 3 years was, at least probably 20 to 30 centimeters above the top of the rod, which was fairly high. Again, this is in the wet season, so it's expected to be decently high, but pretty high. And then here's our soil elevations that were calculated by calculating the difference between the water level above benchmark and the standing water measurement or the groundwater measurement. So again, second year even higher. And I want to emphasize some of the water depths on the islands as we were walking around were thigh to waist deep, especially on the margins as you're coming in. Not always easy to get onto the islands. Some were such that you would have to jump outside the island and trudge through the sawgrass marsh just to get onto the island. And then in year 3, water levels back down a little bit. Okay. Wildlife camera setup. This picture illustrates the cameras that we used. These are Tacticam Reveal cameras, remote mobile signal cameras, able to be observed of the photos with a website subscription and a app on your cell phone. So we had 12 cameras total on 6 islands with 2 cameras per island. And they specifically wanted 6 in the Blue Shanty Flowway and 6 outside to the east in the larger water conservation area. We were able to equip them with solar panels and lithium-ion batteries to keep them operational all the time, which was handy. Maybe not as easy to do if the canopy is real tight, but in this case, there was enough sunlight coming through. Verizon mobile data plan. In the Everglades, Verizon seemed to be the only carrier that seemed to work relatively well with these cameras. And then the camera, of course, the Reveal app for viewing the photos daily and monitoring the status of the cameras, making sure they were fully operational or if they needed maintenance. So yeah, the pros, remote access to evaluate the photos and what's going on the islands. We even picked up a few people on these islands, including some of the invasive plant control people and possibly some Miccosukee tribe folks. And anyway, so having remote access was key in this situation because they're so remote. One con, some of the cons were spotty cell service occasionally, and then to get the higher resolution photo files, you had to physically pull the SD cards. And then you're also not able to add or edit text on the bottom of the photos. That may have changed. Tacticam's continually making improvements to their cameras and their functionalities, but at the time we were not able to do that. So while on the islands conducting the vegetation monitoring and the soil elevation, we also made wildlife observations. And here's a few interesting photographs of some of the cool herps or reptiles and amphibians that we observed. An eastern five-lined skink, green anole, and a green tree frog. And interestingly enough, these three species are pretty widespread throughout the entire state of Florida. A lot of the species on these tree islands I was very familiar with, not living in South Florida myself, but just from growing up and living in Florida, very, very ubiquitous species. Okay, here's a list of all the wildlife camera species that were all wildlife species detected by the cameras in each year. And I've highlighted green, kind of indicates the raptors, birds of prey, a good variety of those and some interesting species. Let me just say that I'm very much a bird person, and so birds intrigue me a lot. So I may have focused in on the birds a little more here for you, but yeah, so the yellow are the most commonly observed species. So gray catbird, very common on these islands. North American river otter. And the other most commonly, and probably the most commonly camera photographed species would be the black rat, Rattus rattus. And every time nocturnal, climbing up and down the trees. Interesting finding, I think. And I will also note that not one Burmese python was detected on these islands. Now, I hesitate to make any conclusions about that because I've talked to python researchers who say they're notoriously difficult to capture on motion censored cameras because they move very slow and also sometimes underneath other vegetation or things that mask them from the camera. One reptile that was non-native that we detected was an agama, which is a type of lizard in our last year of monitoring. And they are fairly common in South Florida, but not common on these tree islands. I don't know if they're necessarily more or less aquatic species, but that was an interesting data that we collected. All right, so here are what we recorded while conducting the vegetation and soil monitoring. These species, a lot of the same species that were detected by the cameras, but some that weren't, including, well, Chuckwill's widow was in one camera we'll see here in a minute on a photo, but we were very surprised that Chuckwill's widow, a species of nightjar that is a ground nester, was detected on, also a migratory species, was detected on these tree islands. All of the yellow highlighted species on this list, I highlighted because they are migratory bird species. So yeah, migratory birds come through and utilize these islands on their migrations as resting and feeding habitats. So somewhat very important fact of these islands. Okay, getting into some of the photographs. Again, the most commonly photographed species from the cameras, and only nocturnal and only arboreal. Rattus rattus. Also, one would think that if there were a lot of pythons, or even some pythons on these islands, that there wouldn't be as many rats. Also, potentially, it could have been the same rats, same few rats going up and down every night, being picked up by these cameras. So Not truly definitive that they're the most common, but they're the most often photographed species. North American river otter. And you can see in the photograph on the left, this otter did not mat down all this vegetation. When we maintained and set up the cameras to open up the vegetation to allow more line of sight, we chopped back the vegetation. So this photo was probably captured shortly after we were on site maintaining the cameras. One of our other cameras that we didn't have to do as much maintenance because some previous researchers had been out many years before us and done monitoring and research on these islands and installed little mini boardwalks. And the otters and other animals seem to love to haul out of the water on these boardwalks and dry out and rest and loaf on them. But the otters were nice. They're always cool to see, and they're a really neat animal. Okay, so moving on, more mammals. Raccoons, obviously, you would kind of anticipate to be out on a wetland island, but deer, not so much. These islands are pretty far out in the sawgrass marshes, and so a deer would have to do a significant amount of wading and or swimming through potentially alligator habitat to arrive at these islands. So we were surprised to see deer, and then when we spoke to our airboat driver about it, he said that yes, indeed, deer do occupy these islands, and they move around from island to island. And according to them, there used to be a lot more deer in the area than there are now. His theory is that the water levels on average are not as conducive as they used to be for the deer. The deer seem to like the water when it's lower. Also, we were very surprised. 2 out of the 3 years we captured a Florida black bear. Not always the same one either. And this was a beautiful bear. I'm not sure if it's a male or a female, but nice brown muzzle, just posing for us here. You can see its pads on its paw. They apparently are known to roam through the area. They're not real common in the eastern Everglades, but have been able to utilize man-made levees along some of the canals to traverse and get out to some of these areas. Another deer over here. You can see these are great habitat shots that show that they're going to these islands to go after the soft, palatable grasses and herbaceous vegetation that grows underneath the trees. There are significant patches of various types of grasses. But one thing about these tree islands is they kind of orient along slightly higher north to south ridges in the limestone, I guess, substrate, which causes the elevation to be slightly higher. So some of these animals can like walk or traverse along these quote unquote ridges and get to the islands a little easier than if they had to swim through the deeper portions of the Everglades. Okay, on to my favorite animals, birds. Beautiful gray blue heron. Again, same location as that river otter we saw a minute ago, it looks like. And this is a red-shouldered hawk, probably the most common hawk species in the Everglades and in throughout Florida. Non-migratory resident species. And this was a dramatic picture of it flying straight at the camera. Great horned owl in the daytime, which was kind of surprising. It's a little overexposed photo. That's one additional drawback of some of these wildlife cameras, is that it's difficult to control the exposure level. But for the most part, they were good at capturing and getting photos pretty well without having to worry about exposure. And black turkey vultures, again, on the little boardwalks where the river otter was. These were very often photographed on these boardwalks. And with a face only a mother could love. Again, another view on the left of a green heron hanging out on this branch. And this was a pretty good spot for the camera. We got lots of pictures of birds for the most part and some rats on this particular tree. And as you can see, some of the trees weren't growing vertical, they were growing horizontal. So it wasn't always easy to get DBHs on some of them. But on the right, we have another great blue heron. The left photo, again, shows a little bit different vegetation than the classic pond apple leather fern. It shows cocoa palm, which is another very common species on these tree islands, which is a more or less a tropical shrub, small tree species that sprawls way out and makes it interesting to get DBH measurements on. Okay, a few more birds, and then we're closing in on the end here. Gray catbird, one of our most common captures, sitting on this Dahoon holly tree branch, one broken off. So here's a prime example of a multi-trunked tree that we would measure. And from time to time, one of the trunks would die. So yeah, we would measure both trunks and add them together, or actually keep them separate, but keep them noted as the same tree. And this photo on the left actually is a good one to show a nice little stand of buttonbush, which is a common wetland shrub throughout Florida, Cephalanthus occidentalis, and some beautiful blooms of bladderwort. So underwater submerged bladderwort, and it's zooplankton feeding species in the Utricularia genus. And over here on the right, I love this photo and I hate it at the same time. We have a Cooper's hawk that has just recently preyed on this Chuck-Will's widow. This was not a very common thing to capture. This was the only one we captured, but it was quite dramatic. And I like the photo, but I also like Chuck-Will's widows too. And then coming down the home stretch here, we have a blue jay, believe it or not. Blue jays, cardinals on these islands, a lot of common bird species. One other thing I think I failed to mention was that back on the species slide, and I showed you all the migratory bird species, a lot of migratory warblers, neotropical warblers, were detected on these islands. American redstarts, yellow-rumped warblers, black and white warblers, black-throated blue warblers, and a lot of northern water thrushes, which are a warbler species that you would expect to find on a wetland island like this. But yeah, so a lot of neotropical warblers. And then here on the right side is a common grackle yelling at, if you can see it here, what looks like a red-shouldered hawk up in this tree. It's a little action shot for you. And finally, last but not least, we were able to capture some insect species, including this laurel swallowtail, or also known as the Palamedes swallowtail. And this is a cool shot because on this island, this was one of the only islands that had some high ground. So you can see high and dry ground with a enormous strangler fig. This is a strangler fig that has probably overtaken whatever tree it was strangling and become its own giant tree. And then a couple of last here nocturnal captures. Eastern screech owls were common on the islands, commonly photographed with the cameras. And then going back to our favorite strangler fig here, a young black bear was captured on this island. This is a cool shot because when we set up the camera, we were like, oh, this is a perfect tree to, get an animal, lots of animals on. And then it was kind of not so great for a while, weren't getting much, and then all of a sudden, bam, we've got a nice bear, Florida black bear. A really cool shot. Okay, some general observations of note. 48 wildlife species were recorded on the wildlife cameras. 48 species. This particular tree island, 31-2B, had the most in 24 wildlife captures of the camera captures combined with both cameras on this island at 665 captures. So think about that. Think about that. Those are just the captures of that pictures that were taken that included wildlife, not including any false triggers, which did occur fairly often. We can adjust the camera sensitivity, and we did, which helps. So do other little tricks to help reduce the amount of data without any observations that you're getting. Water levels during the wet season, all the water level measurements were taken during the wet season showed significant inundation already occurs on all tree islands. So think about that, and think about the reason that we're monitoring these islands is to, gauge as they possibly increase flow or increase water through here. Granted, they will be using the historic wet and dry season cycles, so that should account for that, even though more water might be moving through the area. Soil elevation measurements are somewhat variable, so more data the better to get an average elevation. So maybe think about taking more than 3 data points on each island's head. Basically, they're varied because of the nature of trying to measure the water, and finding the ground surface on a wetland tree island that's submerged is, not always able to find the exact firm ground, or you are, but you're not sure if you're hitting leaves or a root or whatever else. Fairly consistent though. All right, so we had 21 migratory bird species observed, and this suggests that the islands are important to migratory birds. And this observation has been made by others as well. So low levels of invasive plant species, and this is likely due to the ongoing professional management and control, exotic invasive species control. Really notable was no python observations. So either while we were walking around and extensively traversing and walking on these islands, or on the wildlife cameras, no pythons observed. Numerous small mammal photo captures. So these two items could suggest that the pythons aren't going out onto these islands quite as much as the levees or the areas out where they're known to inhabit a little bit more. Either that, or who knows, more study could flesh this out. There's very much numerous opportunities for further study and various comparison analyses as we get more data collection into the future. And we did make some suggestions in our final report as to some of the analyses that could be run. And I can share that report with anybody. It's available on the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Southern Everglades data distribution website, which I did not get the link for in time to put in this presentation, but I can share that with folks. And thank you again for the opportunity to present to you today. These are the partners that we partnered with and worked with on this project. With that, I will leave it open to questions. This is our team, and this is Jennifer right here, and this is me, and this is a couple of other staff that helped out, and some nice landscape photos of the Everglades. It's a very beautiful area.
Thank you very much, Pete, for that educational
You're
webinar
welcome.
in the Everglades, a location that I am not able to get to on a regular basis. So it's nice to be able to have more national, international perspective when we do these webinars. So thank you very much for your time this afternoon. We do have some questions and we have some time for you to respond to these questions. So I'll take the questions from the audience first before I get to my questions, if we have time. Who provided the monitoring funding to do this work was the first question that came in.
Yes, that would be the Army Corps of Engineers. We contracted through the Jacksonville district of the Army Corps, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And they are at the time they were over the Everglades restoration. I believe there's a transition going on right now to the more of that work to the state of Florida and the Southwest or South Florida Water Management District.
Yeah, we had a question concerning wildfires this year impacting these islands, and your islands in particular, that you were doing your monitoring on the past couple of years.
Were wildfires an issue for us out there? No, they were not. They do break out from time to time in the areas. We were there in the wet season, so a little bit less chance of encountering a wildfire when the water's high.
Okay. Next question, Rattus native out there, the rat species, are they native out there? Or are they invasive critters?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think Rattus is native to North America. They might be European, but they've been here since early colonization, I believe. So yes, they've been here for a long time, centuries.
Okay. Next question, was it surprising that there was no captured images and observations of waterfowl species within the islands?
By waterfowl, are we referring to ducks and geese?
Yes, I'll interpret that as yes.
Okay. It was a little surprising at first, but then I came to realize that the native ducks and geese and so forth don't tend to inhabit the eastern Everglades, which is dominated by the sawgrass marshes and openings with periphyton and lilies, as you can see in these pictures. For whatever reason, it's shallow as well, and there's plenty of other more productive open water areas. In some of the water control areas or water management areas to the north and other areas. So yeah, hardly saw any waterfowl during our study in the eastern Everglades there.
Okay.
Now they do show up in the canals and more open watery areas, but did not seem to, especially like on the islands, I wouldn't expect to see waterfowl because of the heavy vegetation and trees and so forth.
So we have a few more questions. We still have a little bit more time, so I'm going to keep going if that's okay with you.
Yeah, totally fine.
Someone was asking about an explanation for the benchmark for soil elevation measurements. Were these measurements to determine subsidence or accretion in the future?
Yes. So if with these tree islands build up soil elevation with productive vegetation, and if the islands were to, I believe this is why they wanted that measurement taken, if the islands were to start becoming flooded out and the trees dying out, eventually their elevation would start subsiding because of the lack of organic matter breaking down and contributing to the soil elevation.
Okay, next question. Are there any mangroves present in the Everglade areas where you did your study?
No, this was all freshwater habitat, no mangroves.
Yeah, so that ties into a question that I was going to ask you about the salinity. What is the approximate salinity of this area? Was it brackish or completely freshwater? I mean, even freshwater has some level of salinity, but can we assume this is essentially a freshwater system because it's land drainage?
Yes, Roy, yes, that's true. Completely fresh water. We did not measure the salinity per se while we were out there, but completely fresh water and generally very clear, well filtered. I've heard it said that the system of the Everglades is somewhat oligotrophic, low nutrient system.
Okay. This, because I work for the Army Corps of Engineers, I could potentially help you with this question if you need it. Did you consider any ways to stretch the monitoring funding to the original 5 years instead of just 3 years?
No, because that would have been nice, but we weren't aware that it was only going to be 3 years until after the third year.
Yeah, my response to that is usually Army Corps of Engineers, federal agency, they have the guidance that has very specific monitoring periods that you can't go beyond, because then you'd have to get additional authorization to change the original scope of work, things of that sort. So you can't just
Yeah,
start to change those things.
and I think some of the transition from federal to state um, control of the projects out there had something to do with it too, but I'm not sure.
Okay. Another question, have you considered automated water level logging devices or telemetry to your logging devices? Do you have to go out there and download the data, or was it done remotely?
I'm not sure. The data we were doing was not remote collected data, but the Army Corps and the South Florida Water Management collect extensive remote sensing data out in these, and they have stations all over the place out here. I didn't get any pictures of them, but there's a link I can go to if I can get back to. Sorry, I'm having trouble getting it to go fast, but there's a website you can go to with all of the access to all the remote sensing water level data that they collect out there called Edens. That's the Everglades Depth Estimation Network, and they even have some of the Tree Island, a lot of the Tree Island data on there. I'll go back to these links, and I'll make sure these links get shared with all the participants too. This Eden link is a really interesting website to check out. It has a ton of information and even some interactive mappers that you can zoom in on to particular islands or areas and monitoring stations.
And the next question, I do realize that your specific study site was WCA-3B in a portion of the Everglades. This question is, any significant tidal effects in the Everglades? And I think that question is going to universally in the Everglades, certainly where you were, especially because you already said it's all freshwater. Well, not likely any kind of tidal signal where you were that far into the mainland portion of Florida. But I'll read the question again. Any significant tidal effects in the Everglades?
You're correct, Roy. No tidal effects observed in this portion of the Everglades. It's pretty deep into the Everglades and buffered to the east by the Miami Ridge, if you will, along the coast. But definitely, as you go further south, I would think you would come into more. You would find some tidal influence further south and definitely into Biscayne Bay.
Okay. We have time for one more question, and this question is coming from Roy Massaros, your moderator. I wanted to know something about what not hydraulic, but hydrologic analyses you did. When I think of wetland planning and design, I think about water budgets. Obviously, you had an abundance of land discharge. I don't know, you did a water budget, but for any type of hydrologic analysis with something like HEC HMS, was any of that done for your area, or you just assume you had plenty of water on site?
No, that was not done. It was we were more focused just on the tree islands and measuring the soil elevations. But I'm sure that some of those types of analyses have and or are being run by others doing data collection and research on the area.
Yeah, I thought that would be the case because you were talking about levees and channelized flow, and that made me think about what analysis would be done to understand what's happening with all of that as far as driving a water bite is concerned.
You can go to some of these links here and probably find out all the information you wanted to know about that and more.
Okay. So that then brings us to our conclusion. I want to thank you again, Pete, for your time that you offered to our group today and presenting your research, your study. We very much appreciate your time and what you shared with us. And at this point, thank you. And I will turn it back to our host, SWS Justin.
Thank you so much, Roy. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here.
And Justin, I don't know if you have any concluding remarks, or we just stop the Zoom presentation.
Just thank you to our speakers, to our speaker, Peter Johnson. Another thank you to our sponsors, SWCA, Meristem, Res, and Davy Mitigation. Thank you for making these webinars possible. And then just another quick reminder about upcoming events and webinars. We will be taking a break from our webinars in June for our large annual meeting in New Orleans. So I know there's a couple spaces still available for that event. So definitely make sure you register for that if you haven't done so. And then we will have another webinar in July about the Ashland Mill Dam removal. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you again, Peter, and our moderator, Roy, and everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.